Here we go. This is NSCA Essentials of Personal Training, Chapter 10, and we're still talking about fitness evaluation, selection, and administration. We're now into presentation 2, and we're trying to talk. We're talking about choosing appropriate assessments and the different types of evaluations that you'll have when you're evaluating your clients. With the assessment itself, and I alluded to this a little bit in the previous presentation, where it depends upon the body that's in front of you. Here, you have somebody who is an 18-year-old athlete. It's going to be a different series of assessments than somebody who is 80 years old. And to that end, you're trying to look at this from the prism of like sports performance if you're working with athletes, but if you're working with clients from the general population, your goal really is to improve the health and fitness of the client and do so with minimized or reduced risk. And there's no one size fits all test battery, and I agree with this in the book. And as a trainer, you're free to create your own testing protocols. And for some of you, your testing protocols may be very formalized and very, if you will, clinically based, where you're doing any number of different measurements and evaluations and really trying to dial in with your client in a real clinical sense. For many of you, if you're working in a fitness facility, it just doesn't have the actual laboratory space, if you will, to be able to work with your clients in a more clinical type of assessment. You might actually do stuff more ad hoc and kind of on the fly, but you can still find ways to evaluate your clients in a way to kind of quantify and qualify their current levels of fitness, if you will, and ability to basically quantify and qualify their levels of performance, but also progress. And that becomes part of the process too, because you have to be able to talk about the progress that you have with the client. Um, the the book makes this point here that these wide range of fitness tests available, and as you become more involved in the industry, you get better at kind of picking out which tests you want to use and which ones you'd like to utilize for different populations. And if you're on the strength conditioning side of the house, we could have the conversation of perhaps you could have a core series of assessments that you'll use for all your athletes, but some other additional assessments might be used for football. Other assessments might be used for baseball and softball or volleyball or basketball. But you might have your core 4 or 5 exercises or assessments that you use, and then thereafter you become more specialized. So you have kind of this generalized population, or if you will, I should say generalized pool of questions, and then you have a more specific pool of assessments. I said questions. And so to that end, you kind of look at it and go, okay, how can I actually have broad-based, and I can compare across all my sports, different performance measures for all sports, but then how can I dial it down to make it more specific for each sport? And it comes down to the actual assessments, being able to evaluate what sports require or what their needs are for that particular sport. Now, they talk about formative and summative evaluation, and man, these can be kind of confusing when you look at it at first. And the formative, they kind of listed here in terms of specific testing protocols with subjective observations beginning and throughout the process, used for planning, programming, and providing feedback, and includes very subjective, if you will, observations. So, when you look at this and you go, okay, the formative assessments take place before the program begins and periodically throughout the training period. They offer a personal trainer opportunities to formulate or plan a program, give the client feedback, and make modifications to the program while still in progress. I would say this just in terms of trying to remember this. With formative, it's not the end result. It's kind of like in the process and how you're evaluating and course correcting, evaluating performance, but also course correcting your programming based upon the verbal and nonverbal feedback that you're receiving from your client. They can't achieve the rep and set combinations that you put out for them. That's a feedback tool. They're unable to sustain certain exercises at the intensity level that you want them to work in terms of running or perhaps doing cardiovascular. Well, that's a feedback tool. So you look at this and you kind of go, the formative evaluation can include very much a specific test protocol that's done somewhere in a series of workouts, but also it can be very, if you will, subjective and ongoing as you go through a mesocycle or a training session with your client. So it's not really where it's just kind of singular. that ends up being more along the lines of when you get to summative evaluations, and it's when they complete a specified training period, class, or season. So it's a sum total of what has been accomplished in a given period. And that's where the term summative comes from. And you look at the assessments that are used at the beginning, the midpoint, and perhaps at the end. And you would presume that the beginning workout metrics, if you will, the results that you would receive will be different on the front end than the actual back end. And that makes sense because when you first meet that person day one, perhaps they're deconditioned or you have very specific training goals in mind and your training programming drives towards those training goals. The person should, in essence, have had a performance increase over a 12-week mesocycle with you. So a good example of this is a team goes through like a preseason mesocycle and they get done with their mesocycle to go into their in-season training mode. It's the sum of what has been accomplished during that preseason mesocycle. That's within a particular, very specific given period of time. And it's a matter of comparing and contrasting your performance measures on the front end with your performance measures on the back end. All right, moving on to the next one.